Some people say that the key skill you need to be a politician is this. You have to be an expert at talking endlessly while saying nothing. And while it might sound like a bit of a joke, the fact is that politicians actually need this skill because media are regularly trying to trap them in their words. Which begs a question. Is being able to talk endlessly while saying nothing actually such a bad thing? When we're in hostile environments, our words count because they can be easily misunderstood or misrepresented. For example, if you said in a church environment, "Let's go out and get some people saved," church people might understand what you mean. But what about the non-believer listening to the recording later? How are you going to get some people saved? Are you going to push your beliefs on them? That doesn't sound good. And this means we need to be aware of what our words might sound like to others. Now, the politically correct way of saying the same thing always takes longer. For example, let's go out and encourage people to consider the Christian message of hope. But this longer path is also worth it because cultural misunderstandings come at a cost. This care with words is important nowhere more than when discussing the controversial moral topics of the day. Maybe currently including things like sex out of marriage, pornography, prostitution, homosexuality, legalizing certain drugs, abortion, euthanasia, freedoms of speech and religion, and more. Because we can think we're saying one thing while those listening hear another. So today, to bring a number of things we've discussed in the series together, I'm going to share some examples of things I've said in conversation to reinforce that we really are wise sometimes to say nothing, only unless we can really say something. I'm rarely asked my opinion on controversial issues, but my approach is usually to avoid a direct answer while indicating that I'm generally morally conservative, but most importantly, I affirm the need for freedoms to exist in a society for people to hold different views. And usually making this point is enough, because while I haven't answered their stated question, I've usually answered their unstated and emotional question. You see, a big fear that the public have these days is that because the Christian faith holds to certain moral views, it might become the cause of discrimination. Now, this idea is actually crazy to me because the Christian faith is the source of our nation's values on things like charity, equality, and tolerance. We're the people who help others, irrespective of differences, every day all around the globe. But the public aren't being told this. We have a branding problem, so we need to be wise. But let's be clear, the real question is often the question behind the question. And it can be something like this: are you a prejudiced, biased bigot? And that's why answering the stated question is sometimes a foolish thing to do. This is why on some occasions I've replied moral questions by saying, "Oh, you're trying to ask if I'm a judgmental person." No, I'm not. And this reply has often been sufficient because I've answered the real question. Earlier in this series, I mentioned a friend's question, which I replied by saying, "Do you really think we know each other well enough to talk about this?" A similar reply question is, "Do you really think our society's tolerant enough to allow these sorts of conversations?" And these are great questions because this digs at what being tolerant in a society is actually about. Because tolerance isn't about agreeing with each other. Tolerance is actually about how we treat each other, irrespective of how much we disagree. But if someone really is pressing for an answer to a moral question, then maybe we need to reply their question with a question about where moral beliefs and values come from. For example, why do you ask this question? What's your particular interest in it? And why do you pick this moral issue and not another? Because ultimately, the question that sits behind all moral questions is singularly this: where does morality come from? Answer this question and you'll have your answer. You see, if they say a society's moral values and lists of right and wrong are made up by us, then I'd affirm they're right in saying that nothing's actually morally wrong or right, because the lists are made up and can be changed. But if they say morality comes from God, then haven't they answered their own question? Which makes the important question, does God actually exist? And also, how should we treat each other even when we disagree? You see, every society has its prejudices. It was true of Jesus' society and it's true of ours. Yet we must still engage. And that's why we must learn how to be as wise as serpents, but as harmless as doves. Jesus engaged with the interested. He intrigued the disinterested. He deflected the hostile. He sometimes said nothing, only unless through questions he could really say something. Let's learn from him.